It started with a simple fence. I had just moved into my new home, looking forward to the peace and quiet of suburban life. And as a first-time homeowner, I was eager to make the place my own. The backyard was perfect for a garden, and the front yard needed just a few tweaks. One of the first things I wanted to do was put up a fence, a small, simple fence to define the boundaries of my property. Nothing too fancy, just something that would provide a bit of privacy and keep my dog from wandering off. I had no idea that this simple, everyday task would soon spiral into a nightmare that would take over my life. I didn't know that the HOA in this neighborhood was more than just a neighborhood watch. They were a controlling, power-hungry organization that didn't care about anything but enforcing their arbitrary rules. And I didn't know that the woman in charge of it all, Karen, would become my worst nightmare. At first, Karen seemed like any other neighbor. She was always walking around the neighborhood, stopping to chat, offering unsolicited advice about the proper way to maintain a yard. But she quickly made it clear that she wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, and she took that role very seriously. Too seriously, it seemed. She always had something to say about the condition of other people's properties. If someone's grass was a little too long, Karen was there with a note. If a fence was slightly out of place, you could bet she'd be knocking on your door, demanding it be fixed. So, when I went ahead with putting up my new fence, I thought little of it. I followed the guidelines, kept it the correct height, used the appropriate materials, and made sure it was well within my property line. But then Karen came knocking. At first, I didn't think much of it when she walked up to my door. She had a smile on her face, but I could tell there was something off about her. She was holding a clipboard, and when I opened the door, she wasted no time in getting straight to the point. "I noticed you put up a fence," she said, her tone polite but insistent. "I just wanted to let you know that it doesn't meet HOA standards." My heart sank. I had made sure everything was up to code. I asked her what specifically was wrong, but she simply pointed to the back of the house and said, "It's too tall in certain areas, and it's not the right color. You'll need to take it down and replace it with something that adheres to our guidelines." I stood there, stunned. "But I followed the rules," I protested. "I even checked with the HOA before putting it up. Everything is fine." Karen just smiled and shook her head. "That may be true, but it still doesn't meet our standards. You'll need to fix it, or you'll face a fine." "A fine? For a fence?" I was furious, but I tried to keep calm. I wasn't going to let her bully me into tearing down my fence. "I'm not taking it down," I said firmly. "I've done everything by the book, and I'm not going to tear it down because it doesn't match your personal preferences." She didn't back down. "If you don't remove it, we'll have no choice but to take you to court. The HOA can't allow this to set a precedent." I was speechless. How could a simple fence turn into a legal battle? But Karen wasn't done. She handed me a formal notice, stating that I had violated HOA rules and that I would be taken to court if the issue wasn't resolved. I was in shock. How had it gotten to this point? The next few weeks were filled with anxiety. I hired a lawyer and tried to gather every scrap of evidence I could to show that my fence was within the rules. But every time I thought the case was going in my favor, Karen found a new way to escalate things. Her threats of court grew more serious, and I began to realize that she wasn't just trying to get me to tear down my fence. She was after something else, something much bigger. Eventually, the case went to court. I thought it was ridiculous, but I was determined to fight back. My lawyer and I showed up, ready for a fight. But when Karen walked in, I couldn't help but notice something strange. She wasn't just there to represent the HOA. She was wearing a smug smile, as though she already knew how this was going to play out. I was confused. Was she that confident? The hearing began, and Karen's attorney made their case. They argued that my fence violated HOA rules, that it was too tall in certain areas, and that it didn't match the approved color scheme for fences in the neighborhood. I sat there, listening to the absurd claims, growing more and more frustrated. But then, Karen's attorney made a shocking revelation. The HOA has records of multiple fines levied against this property for various violations, the lawyer said. And yet, the defendant has failed to pay the fines in full, continuing to defy HOA regulations. We demand these fines be paid before any further discussions are made regarding the fence. "What? Fines?" I had no idea what they were talking about. I looked at my lawyer, who was just as confused as I was. "Can they do that?" I asked. My lawyer whispered back, "They may be pulling something out of nowhere. We need to see the documents they're referring to." I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just about a fence. This was a trap. Karen had been hiding something, and it wasn't just about me breaking a small rule. She was using fines to force me into a corner. The next few weeks were filled with more surprises. Karen and her team brought up more and more fines that I had never been informed of. Each fine seemed to be for something trivial: an overgrown lawn here, a mailbox that wasn't styled correctly there. But when put together, they totaled a significant amount. They were trying to pressure me into paying these fines, something I had never been aware of, and I realized that this was Karen's plan all along. She wasn't just trying to get me to take down my fence. She was using the fines to bleed me dry, forcing me to pay for things that I didn't even know existed. I started digging into these fines, looking for inconsistencies. I spent hours combing through HOA records, court documents, and even the property tax files. And that's when I stumbled upon something huge, something that made my stomach drop. Karen had been issuing fines left and right to homeowners in the neighborhood, fines that were never fully processed. They had been documented but never followed up on, and they were piling up in a way that I couldn't ignore. It was as if Karen had been using these fines to create a secondary income stream for herself. The fines were often inflated, and many homeowners had no idea that they were even being charged until it was too late. Some had paid, some had ignored the notices, but the total amount she had generated from these fines was staggering. Millions of dollars, hidden under the guise of neighborhood regulations. I had just uncovered the tip of the iceberg. As I stared at the records in front of me, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Karen had been running a scheme on the HOA's fines, manipulating the system to her benefit. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a systematic effort to extract money from homeowners in the neighborhood. Fines for trivial violations were piling up, and Karen was either collecting the payment herself or letting them accrue in a way that benefited her. And I had been blind to it. I immediately took action, gathering the evidence I had collected over the last few weeks, copies of the fines, payment records, and the inconsistencies in the fines themselves. I wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. If she thought she could use her power to make money off the backs of the homeowners, she was wrong. It was time to expose her for the fraud she was. I met with my lawyer that afternoon, explaining everything I had uncovered. He listened intently, his expression becoming more serious with every word I spoke. "This is big," he said when I finished. "Karen isn't just trying to pressure you into tearing down your fence. She's using these fines to create a parallel cash flow, one that's completely off the books. This could be more than just a civil case. We might be looking at something criminal." I nodded, knowing that he was right. If I was going to take her down, I couldn't just fight her over the fence. I had to focus on the bigger picture. The fines were her leverage, and now that I knew what she had been hiding, I was going to use it against her. We spent the next few days gathering more information. My lawyer contacted the local authorities to discuss the illegal fine scheme, and we started putting together a formal report. Karen's influence was vast, but the more I dug, the more I realized how far-reaching her corruption really was. She wasn't just exploiting me. She had been exploiting the entire neighborhood for years. And the more people who came forward, the stronger our case became. But even as I began to feel more confident, I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. She had spent years cultivating her position in the HOA, and she wasn't going to let someone like me destroy everything she had built. I started receiving more threats, more veiled warnings that I should back off before things got worse. The calls and messages grew more intense. One afternoon, I received a text that made my stomach churn. "You're making a mistake. Keep pushing and you'll regret it. You don't know who you're messing with." At first, I thought it was just another attempt to scare me into submission. But then, I noticed something that chilled me even more. The message wasn't sent from an unknown number. It was from Karen herself. I showed the message to my lawyer, and he immediately contacted the authorities again. This was a step too far. Karen was now directly threatening me, and this was no longer just about offense. She was using her power to intimidate and manipulate. I wasn't the only one she had tried to bully into submission, There were others in the neighborhood who had fallen victim to her tactics, and I was determined to make sure they didn't go unnoticed. We started to build a stronger network of support. Neighbors who had been intimidated by Karen came forward, sharing their own stories of how she had used the HOA rules to squeeze money out of them, often for violations that weren't even legitimate. As the testimonies piled up, it became clear that Karen had built an empire on fear, manipulation, and corruption. But no one could ignore the evidence now. We had enough to take her down, and I wasn't going to stop until I saw it through. I started working with the authorities, and soon, the investigation into Karen's illegal activities intensified. She was no longer just an HOA president who had a few disagreements with a neighbor over a fence. She was a criminal who had been exploiting her position of power for years, and now the walls were closing in on her. Despite all the pressure, I wasn't about to let Karen get the best of me. I had seen her threats, felt the weight of her intimidation, but I wasn't backing down. The more I thought about the other homeowners she had bullied, the more determined I became. Karen's empire was built on lies, and it was time for it to come crashing down. Then, as I prepared for the next phase of the case, something unexpected happened. Karen's lawyer called me. He wanted to make a deal. "We're prepared to settle this, but we need you to drop the charges against Karen," he said, his tone smooth and almost condescending. "She's willing to make some changes to the HOA regulations, to pay a fine, and to avoid the public scandal if you agree to keep this all quiet." I could hear the smugness in his voice, as if he truly believed I'd be tempted by their offer. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. This was their strategy: buy me off, keep me quiet, and pretend like nothing had happened. They thought they could just brush me aside with a few changes to the rules. I didn't hesitate. "No deal," I said, my voice unwavering. "Karen has used the HOA for her own personal gain for too long, and I'm not letting her get away with it. This isn't about money or some quick settlement. It's about accountability." The lawyer on the other end sighed, as if he had expected my response but hoped for something different. "You'll regret this," he said, before hanging up. I sat back, my heart pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. Karen was cornered now, and there was no way out for her. But I had to be ready for anything. She wasn't going to go down without a fight, and I knew she would pull out all the stops to protect herself. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished yet. I had exposed her for what she was, but she still had resources, and I wasn't sure just how far she would go to keep her secret intact. The next move was hers, but I was ready for whatever came next. The following days felt like an endless waiting game. Every knock on the door or car that slowed down outside made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to let this end quietly. It wasn't in her nature. She had spent years building a network of influence and control, and now, with everything on the line, she wasn't about to let go of it without a fight. I kept getting strange calls, sometimes from numbers I didn't recognize, sometimes from unknown emails. The messages were always vague, cryptic warnings to back off. They weren't directly from Karen, but the tone was unmistakable. She was sending her minions to keep me on edge. I could feel the pressure mounting, and each day, the intensity seemed to grow. Then came the day I got the call I'd been expecting, but still wasn't prepared for. It was from Sarah, the lawyer who had been helping me build the case. Her voice was tight, barely controlled. "I need you to meet me in person right away," she said. "This is urgent." When I arrived at her office, she was pacing, her face pale. "There's something you need to see," she said, handing me a thick folder filled with documents. My stomach dropped as I scanned the pages. The first thing that stood out was a list of bank transactions, a series of payments going from Karen's personal accounts to several shell companies, companies that, on paper, didn't seem to exist. "Karen wasn't just laundering money through the HOA," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "She's been involved in more than just fraudulent fines. These shell companies, they've been used to funnel millions of dollars. And we just found out that she's been using these companies to bribe local politicians and developers, keeping her influence growing." I couldn't believe what I was reading. The scale of Karen's operation was far beyond what I had ever imagined. She had manipulated the HOA system to amass wealth, yes, But now I was seeing the true extent of her corruption. She wasn't just trying to push people out of the neighborhood for personal gain. She had turned the HOA into a front for something much larger, a money laundering operation that had roots in the local government itself. I felt my mind racing. This was no longer just about a fence or a neighborhood dispute. Karen had built an empire, and I had stumbled upon the darkest corners of it. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and now I knew I had to move carefully. The people Karen had aligned herself with were dangerous. If I wasn't careful, I could end up losing everything: my house, my reputation, and possibly more. "Sarah, what do we do with this?" I asked, the weight of the documents in my hands suddenly feeling unbearable. "We have to expose it," she said, her voice more confident now. "But we need to be cautious. The authorities need to act quickly. If we go public too soon, we risk her covering her tracks. We can't afford to give her time to bury the evidence." I nodded, my mind already working through the next steps. We need to get this into the right hands fast. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, preparing everything for the authorities. The evidence was solid, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen would do anything to destroy it. I knew she had influence in the right places, and she wasn't going to let herself get caught without a fight. Then, just as I thought things were starting to take shape, Sarah called me with even more unsettling news. "Karen's moving faster than we thought," she said. "She's trying to sell the properties she's been collecting through the shell companies. If she's able to move the money out of her accounts before the authorities can track it, we'll lose our chance to stop her." It was becoming a race against time. Every moment Karen spent evading the authorities meant more money, more power, and more influence. She was going to keep trying to cover her tracks, and I had to stay one step ahead. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting to stop her from turning the entire neighborhood, and possibly much more, into her personal empire. I gathered everything I had on Karen's activities and worked with the authorities to lock down her assets before she could sell them. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. I could feel the tension mounting as the case neared its climax. Karen knew I was closing in on her, and she wasn't going to make it easy for me. The day the authorities moved in, I received a message from an unknown number. "You're making a huge mistake. You don't know who you're messing with. Karen is just the beginning. You'll be sorry you ever crossed her." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I read those words. The threats were no longer veiled. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me anymore. She was trying to destroy me, to make sure I never exposed what she had been doing. I quickly forwarded the message to Sarah, telling her about the increased threat. As the authorities moved in to freeze Karen's assets, I sat back, watching as everything began to unfold. The news station started picking up on the story, and soon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People were coming forward, sharing their experiences with Karen's manipulative tactics. It was like a domino effect, one after another. The truth about her criminal activities was being exposed. But even as the walls were closing in on Karen, I couldn't help but feel that she was still hiding something. She was too smart to let herself be caught so easily. There had to be something more to her plan, something that I hadn't yet discovered. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen was far too calculated to let everything fall apart without one last trick up her sleeve. The investigation was moving quickly, but I couldn't help feeling that we were missing something. I had been so focused on exposing her fraudulent fines and money laundering operation that I hadn't given much thought to her backup plans. If she was going down, she wasn't going to go alone. The authorities had seized her bank accounts, froze her assets, and even started confiscating properties tied to her shell companies. It seemed like everything was falling into place, but I had this nagging feeling that Karen had anticipated every move we made. I had seen how she operated, how she controlled the HOA, how she manipulated everyone around her. I knew she wouldn't just roll over and accept defeat. I needed to find out what she was planning next. I spent hours, days even, going through public records, property deeds, and financial transactions, hoping to uncover something that could give me a clue. But just when I thought I had hit a wall, a breakthrough came. One of the shell companies that Karen had been using to launder money had an unusual connection to a private trust fund. The trust was registered in an offshore account, with only a few vague details in the paperwork. But the most interesting part was the name attached to it. It wasn't Karen's name. It wasn't even her company's name. It was the name of a prominent local developer, someone whose name I recognized from several recent high-profile real estate deals in the area. This developer had been connected to Karen in the past, but I hadn't thought much of it until now. The connection was too strange to ignore. It looked like Karen had been funneling money, not just through the HOA fines and shell companies, but also directly into a network of real estate deals with this developer. The more I dug into this new lead, the clearer it became. Karen was tied to an even bigger, far-reaching operation than I had originally realized. I called Sarah to fill her in on what I had found. She was shocked at first, but quickly regained her composure. "This is huge," she said, after a long pause. "If Karen is using this developer to funnel money into these properties, it could explain how she's been able to maintain her power. If we can prove the connection between the two of them, it'll be even harder for her to hide behind the HOA and the fake fines." We agreed that we needed to move quickly. We couldn't let Karen cover her tracks now that we were closing in on her. The developer had deep connections, and exposing this part of Karen's operation would be the final nail in her coffin. But we couldn't do it alone. We needed to get more information, and we needed it fast. The next day, I visited the developer's office under the pretense of asking about some property listings. I didn't expect to find much, but I had to try. As I walked into the lobby, I noticed the atmosphere felt different, tense, almost like I was being watched. I walked up to the receptionist and asked about some properties in the area, but her response was cold, almost as if she was hesitant to engage with me. Then, something strange happened. As I was leaving the building, I saw someone from the corner of my eye. It was a man in a dark suit, his face partly hidden by a pair of sunglasses. He was standing by the exit, but the moment he saw me, he quickly turned and walked away. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about the whole interaction didn't sit right. I had a feeling I had been followed. It wasn't just coincidence that the moment I walked in, someone was already keeping an eye on me. Karen's people had to be watching. I wasn't just up against her now. I was up against an entire network of people who had been profiting off of this scam for years. I went home, my mind racing, wondering if I was in over my head. Was I too late? Had Karen already destroyed the evidence? I needed to figure out how to get to the developer without tipping anyone off. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. I continued to dig, tracking down any piece of information I could find, but I was cautious now. I had learned the hard way that every step I took could be one step closer to losing everything. Then, one evening, I got a call from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized the voice on the other end. It was the developer. His voice was low and guarded, and he wasted no time getting to the point. "I know what you're trying to do," he said, his tone unmistakably threatening. "You're poking around where you don't belong. Stop now, or you'll regret it." I felt my pulse race as I tried to keep my composure. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I had to respond carefully. I couldn't let him know I was already onto him. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding through me. "But I'll be happy to have a conversation if you'd like. I'm just trying to understand some of the property deals you're involved in. There seems to be a lot of discrepancies." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him take a deep breath, probably deciding how to respond. "You're digging in the wrong place," he said finally, his voice colder now. "Karen's not the problem. You are. You've crossed the line. If you think you can ruin everything we've worked for, you're gravely mistaken." His words were clear. He wasn't just threatening me. He was warning me, and I knew it wasn't just him. Karen's influence was spreading, and it was bigger than just a few fake fines. It was about power, money, and control. "Maybe it's time to let the truth come out," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The people you've manipulated will stand up. You won't have the same control anymore. You can't hide the truth forever." I hung up the phone, my heart still racing. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Karen's empire was starting to crumble, and the pieces were falling into place. I sat in silence for a moment after hanging up the phone, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The call was a threat, yes, but it was also a confirmation that I was onto something real. The developer's words, "Karen's not the problem," You are," kept ringing in my mind. It was clear that the deeper I dug, the more dangerous this situation became. They weren't just trying to stop me from exposing a simple HOA dispute anymore. No, this was something far more insidious. The walls were closing in. Karen's network was vast, and they weren't going to stop until they silenced me. I knew I had to act fast, but I couldn't let fear guide my actions. I'd come too far to back down now. I needed a strategy, and I needed it quickly. If I could just expose Karen's real plan, then I could destroy her influence once and for all. But there was still so much I didn't know. I picked up the phone and called Sarah. "We need to meet. Now." Within the hour, Sarah and I were sitting at a quiet cafe, a safe distance from Karen's reach. I could see the worry on her face as she listened to my recount of the call. She hadn't been surprised, though. Deep down, we both knew this was the next step in Karen's game. "We're getting close," Sarah said after a long pause. "But we need to be careful. Karen's clearly desperate, and this developer is just the tip of the iceberg. We don't know how deep the corruption runs." "I know," I replied, nodding. "But I have to push forward. The fines, the fake documents, the shell companies, they all point to something bigger. And now the developer is involved too. I'm not stopping until I have everything." Sarah frowned, clearly concerned. "And what if Karen finds out you're onto her? You saw how she reacted when you threatened to expose her. She's already shown she'll go to extreme lengths to protect herself." "Which is exactly why I can't wait any longer," I said, the resolve in my voice growing stronger. "The more I wait, the more she'll have time to cover her tracks. If we're going to bring her down, we need to hit her with everything we've got." The conversation shifted to our next move. We needed concrete evidence, something that would connect Karen directly to the developer, and we needed to move fast. The clock was ticking, and Karen's empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. By the time we parted ways, Sarah had arranged another meeting with the authorities to share the latest findings. I had one more task to handle before we could make our next move. I needed to confront the developer directly. There was something about the way he had spoken during our phone call, the subtle but unmistakable threats. He knew things about me, about what I was planning. If he was willing to threaten me, then he was clearly involved in something far worse than I had initially suspected. I wasn't going to wait for another phone call. I wasn't going to let him play the game any longer. I had to find out exactly what Karen was hiding, and I needed answers. The next morning, I arrived at the developer's office. I had already done my research on him and knew exactly where to find him. His office was tucked away in a sleek, modern building. Everything about it screamed power. He had built his empire on real estate, but I knew that he had been using that power to cover Karen's tracks. The receptionist gave me an odd look when I walked in. I must have seemed out of place in a business suit. She hesitated, then reluctantly directed me to the office of the developer. I took a deep breath before stepping into the elevator, my mind racing with every possibility of what I was about to find out. When I reached the top floor, the door to his office was already ajar. He was sitting behind a large, polished desk, his back to me. His entire demeanor shifted the moment he heard my footsteps. "So you've come," he said without turning around. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "I knew you would." I stood in the doorway, trying to maintain control of my nerves. "You've been working with Karen. You're involved in everything she's been doing. The fake fines, the shell companies, the money laundering. It's all tied together." The developer finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You think you've uncovered something? You think this is just about a fence and some fines? You're in over your head, kid. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I wasn't intimidated. I had everything I needed, and I wasn't going to let him silence me now. "You're in this up to your neck. I know about the trust funds, the accounts, the bribes. Karen isn't just running a neighborhood HOA. She's laundering money through this whole city. And I'm going to expose everything. It's over." The developer smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating. "You don't get it, do you? Karen and I have built this entire network. You think you can just waltz in and tear it all down? You have no idea what you're up against." I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not backing down. You can't intimidate me." The developer's smile faltered for a brief moment before he leaned back in his chair, almost as if he was considering something. "You should be careful. There's more at stake here than just your little fence. You've made a dangerous enemy, and you won't get out of this unscathed." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I knew I couldn't trust him. I couldn't let him intimidate me. "I'm not going anywhere. You're going down, and so is Karen. The truth is coming out." The developer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, but you will. And when you do, it'll be too late." I turned and left the office, my mind racing. The threat was clear, but I wasn't backing down. Karen and her network were cornered, and I could feel the walls closing in on them. But I knew that, for every move I made, they would make one of their own. This wasn't just a fight for my fence anymore. It was a fight for everything I had, and I wasn't going to lose. The encounter with the developer left me with more questions than answers. The way he spoke, so calmly and ominously, made it clear that this wasn't just a business operation. It was personal for him. He wasn't just a real estate mogul. He was entrenched in something much darker. And Karen was the key to it all. I knew the clock was ticking. If Karen and the developer were as connected as I now believed, exposing them would mean uncovering a vast network of corruption, something that could shake the city to its core. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was the danger. Karen wasn't going to let go of her empire without a fight, and the developer's threats still hung heavy in my mind. The following days were a whirlwind of strategy and planning. I couldn't afford to make a misstep. I continued working with Sarah, gathering every shred of evidence I could find. The more I dug, the deeper I got into the tangled web of lies Karen had built. But every step closer to the truth felt like one step closer to danger. The developer had been right about one thing. I wasn't just dealing with a fence dispute anymore. I was up against a multi-million-dollar scheme, money laundering, bribery, and manipulation of local businesses. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor. She was part of a much larger operation. And now that I was onto her, she would do anything to make sure I couldn't bring it all to light. I began receiving more cryptic messages, this time from an untraceable email address. The tone was darker, more threatening. "You don't know the people Karen is connected to. You're walking into a trap. If you expose this, you'll never be able to walk away." Each message was more chilling than the last, designed to intimidate me, to make me doubt whether exposing Karen was worth the risk. But every time I read one, my resolve only hardened. They wanted me to back down, but I wasn't going to. I couldn't. I reached out to the police again, but this time, I was more cautious. The investigation was progressing, but I didn't want to alert Karen or the developer to the fact that I had uncovered the full extent of their operation. If they realized I was getting too close, they could bury the evidence, make it disappear, or worse, silence me completely. The next breakthrough came when Sarah uncovered a pattern. The fines Karen had been doling out weren't just random. They were specifically targeting homeowners who were vulnerable, elderly residents, people who didn't have the means to fight back, or those who were already struggling with personal issues. Karen's system was designed to prey on the weak, forcing them to either comply with her demands or pay exorbitant fines that drained their savings. This was the key. Karen had been building her power by exploiting people who couldn't afford to stand up to her. She was leveraging the HOA's regulations to extort money from the very people who trusted her to maintain the integrity of their neighborhood. It was a disgusting abuse of power, and now that I had this information, it was time to expose it. I spent the next few nights working with Sarah, putting everything together. We started organizing testimonies from neighbors who had been targeted by Karen's fines, as well as gathering the financial records that proved the illegal activities surrounding her shell companies. We had to move quickly. If Karen and the developer realized we were onto them, they would try to erase everything. The night we were ready to go public, I received one final threat. This time, it wasn't just a vague message. It was a call. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. "Stop," the voice on the other end said, cold and unmistakable. "This is your last warning. If you keep digging, you won't just lose everything. You'll lose more than that. You'll never be safe again." I swallowed hard. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. The threat was clear, and for a brief moment, doubt crept into my mind. But I couldn't back down now, not after everything I had uncovered, not after seeing the faces of those Karen had victimized. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice steady despite the fear in my chest. "You'll be the ones who lose. This is bigger than you think, and it's not going away." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice responded, its tone dripping with malice. "You've made a big mistake, and you'll regret it." The call ended abruptly, leaving me in stunned silence. But I didn't let it shake me. Karen and her network might have the power, but I had the truth. And I knew that truth would be the thing that would bring them all down. The next morning, the story went live. The report was thorough, detailing the web of corruption that Karen had built and the money she had been funneling through her illegal fines and shell companies. The evidence was undeniable. Within hours, the authorities began their investigation, seizing Karen's assets and freezing her accounts. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, people were coming forward to share their own stories of how Karen had tried to push them out of their homes. But even as the pieces started to fall into place, I knew this wasn't over. Karen was still out there, hiding, waiting for her next move. She had connections, and I had no doubt she'd try to use them to get back on top. The real battle had only just begun. As the news spread and the investigation ramped up, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. Karen was no longer just the neighborhood HOA president. She had become the face of corruption, and everyone seemed to be rallying against her. But I knew that despite the growing public outcry, Karen wasn't finished yet. She had too much power, too many connections. The real question was, what would she do next? The police were actively digging into her network, and I had to stay one step ahead. But as I continued to receive messages warning me to stop, I realized how deeply entrenched Karen's influence really was. These weren't just empty threats. People around me were being subtly affected by her. Neighbors who had once been supportive were starting to distance themselves. I couldn't help but feel the weight of her reach. She was doing everything she could to undermine me. And every day it seemed like the stakes were getting higher. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from someone I hadn't seen in months, Frank, the old neighbor who had first warned me about Karen's shady tactics. He knocked on my door, looking even more anxious than usual. "I had to come see you," he said, his voice low and hurried. "Karen's not going to let this slide. You're going to make her go down, and she's going to fight dirty to keep herself out of prison. You need to be ready for what she'll do next." I stepped aside to let him in, not entirely surprised. "What do you know?" I asked, my mind already running through scenarios. I had to know what I was up against. "Listen," Frank said, sitting down with a sigh. "I've been trying to lay low, keep out of Karen's way. But I've seen things. You remember the developer she's tied to? He's got more to lose than you think. I've heard rumors that Karen's already talking to her connections in the city. She's desperate. And when people like her get desperate, they start pulling strings you didn't know existed." I felt a chill run through me. "So, you think she's going to retaliate?" Frank nodded. "Not just that. She's already starting to cover her tracks. She's been moving money, selling off properties she's hiding, and I think she's trying to erase the evidence. If you're going to take her down, you've got to act fast before she disappears for good." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Karen was trying to flee, trying to bury everything she had done before it all came crashing down. The developer's involvement was no longer just about a few shady deals. Karen had already started executing her escape plan. This wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was something bigger, something that could send shockwaves through the entire city if the full extent of her corruption came to light. "We need to move," I said, determination setting in. "We can't let her get away with this. I won't let her escape." Frank's face was grim. "I'm with you. I'll help however I can. But we need to be careful. If she's got people watching you, you might be in more danger than you realize." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, thinking about what Frank had said. If Karen was hiding money, moving properties, and preparing to flee, there was no time to waste. She was already preparing her exit strategy, and I had to stop her before she vanished completely. The next morning, I met with Sarah and filled her in on everything. She wasn't surprised by Frank's warnings, but she was equally concerned. "We can't let her leave with everything," Sarah said. "We've got to move quickly. We'll need more solid proof of her financial transactions, and we'll need to make sure the authorities are prepared to act before she disappears." I agreed, and we immediately set to work. We contacted the authorities and briefed them on what we had discovered: how Karen was moving money, selling off properties, and trying to cover up the full extent of her operation. It was clear that we were running out of time, but at least now we had a concrete plan. As the day passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was already one step ahead. She wasn't the kind of person who would go down without a fight. I could feel her presence everywhere, like a shadow watching from the corners of my life. She was out there, preparing to do whatever it took to protect herself. That night, I received another call. It was from the same unknown number I had gotten a few weeks ago, and my pulse quickened when I saw the caller ID. "Are you done yet?" Karen's voice was unmistakable. "I see you've been poking around, trying to expose everything. But you're wasting your time. You think you've got the truth, but you've only uncovered part of the picture. The real power here isn't in the fines or the shell companies. It's much bigger than that. You're already too deep. You'll never get out." I didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you, Karen. The truth is coming out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Her laugh echoed through the phone, cold and calculating. "You don't understand. You've already lost. You've just made yourself a target. The truth is a dangerous thing, and now you'll see just how dangerous it can be." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The threat was clear. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me anymore. She was actively working to silence me, to make sure that I couldn't expose her. I had never felt the weight of the situation as much as I did in that moment. This was no longer a fight for justice. It was a battle for my own safety. I couldn't back down now. Too many people had already been hurt by Karen's actions, and I couldn't let her get away with destroying more lives. But I knew I had to move cautiously. Every decision from here on out had to be carefully planned, because one wrong move could cost me everything. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was a master manipulator with a vast network at her disposal, and I had just poked the hornet's nest. Her warning echoed in my mind. "You've made yourself a target." The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how true that statement was. She wasn't going to stop, not until she'd ensured her secrets stayed buried. I couldn't help but wonder, what would she do next? I had to stay ahead of her, outsmart her, or I might end up as another one of her victims. It felt like I was in a race against time. Every moment that passed brought me closer to uncovering her empire of lies, but it also brought me closer to her making her move against me. The police were working on the case, but Karen had proven time and time again that she wasn't one to go down easily. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. With Sarah's help, we compiled testimonies, bank records, and the key connections that tied Karen to the developer and the real estate deals. It was clear now that Karen's power extended far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood, and if we were going to take her down, we needed to expose everything. But the danger was real, and every step I took felt like I was drawing closer to the edge of a cliff. The authorities were preparing to make their move, and I knew that once they did, Karen would have nowhere to hide. But something still gnawed at me. Karen wasn't the type to just accept defeat. She had already made threats, and I knew she'd try to fight back in any way she could. My mind kept replaying her words. The real power here isn't in the fines or the shell companies. It's much bigger than that. What had she meant? What was she hiding? The night before the authorities were set to make their move, I received a message from an unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat, it was a warning. It read, "Don't trust anyone. Karen's not the only one you should be worried about." The message was cryptic, unsettling, and left me more confused than ever. Was this another attempt by Karen to unsettle me? Or was it a genuine warning from someone who knew more than they were letting on? I had no choice but to proceed. But this time, I wasn't going into it blind. With the information I had, and the determination to see it through, I knew I could expose Karen for the criminal she truly was. The truth was out there, and nothing, no threat, no scheme, was going to stop me from bringing it into the light. And to everyone who's been following this wild ride, make sure to like and subscribe. This is far from over. The truth about Karen, the developer, and everything else is about to be revealed, and you won't want to miss the shocking conclusion. Stay tuned.